Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick 2 to 5 minute review of a couple of smaller items that we've touched on in class, but we didn't really spend a lot of time on, so I know that they can easily be forgotten. What I'm going to look at first is the identity specification. So we looked at the identity specification, and that is where you can get the database to create what's called a surrogate key for you. So I'm going to look at this employee table again. Okay. And I will create it from scratch, but I'm going to look over here at this guy. So we have an employee number, and it is a char3 field, and so on. Just give me a second. I'm going to fast forward through this. All right, there we are. And this is giving us a red line saying that there's already an object named employee in the database, which is true. We already have an employee table, and even if we refresh, it's still there. But if we put an instruction to first delete the table before we create the employee table, then we will have no issues of that sort. Okay, so the identity specification. Up until now, we've been using some sort of external source for where we get our keys from. And for the most part, that works just fine. It just depends on whether or not you have that unique external key. And sometimes when you look at cases, you're going to see that we just don't have any evidence of some way of guaranteed uniquely identifying an employee. So let's suppose, or not necessarily an employee, but whatever entity you happen to be working on for a given project. But what would happen if we had a list of employees? We had all their names and their titles and salaries and start dates, but that list didn't contain an employee number. Well, how would we come up with an employee number? What we have is a mechanism inside the database that can create what's called a surrogate key for us. So the key is generated on the fly when we add an employee to the database. And in SQL, that's called the identity specification. And we use the identity specification to create a sequential number. So usually it starts at 1, and then it goes 2, 3, 4, whatever, because that's the defaults. But it's always an integer. So we're going to go back, we're going to call it employee number again, or empno again, EMPNO, and we're going to make it an integer field this time, because our identity specification requires an integer type for us to be able to add that incrementing number to it, because that is an integer output. So we're going to set this as an identity field. And what happens is if I create this table now, I'm going to hit execute, and that's dropped the table, erasing all of my data and my original spec for my table, and then recreated it now with all of the columns that we had before, only I'm changing this employee number so that it has an integer and this identity specification on it. Okay, so I'm going to go into my employee table. I'm going to right click, edit top 200 rows, and when I add an employee, I'm just going to put my own name here, James Marks, instructor, salary, I don't get paid. It's free work here. It's pro bono. Kidding. And 02, today is, I believe, the 7th. Okay. So you see that automatically the database has generated this number 1 character over here for us. That number 1 is actually the integer 1. And if I add a new employee, we'll call him just new employee. At the moment, nothing else is required, so I'll just tab off of that row, and I end up with employee number 2. And you'll see that if I put another employee, I get employee number 3. So you can see there's a pattern here, 1, 2, 3, whatever. But if for some reason I get an error when I'm trying to insert, it might skip numbers. So we can't depend on it being 100% in order all the time. It's just kind of nice to know that usually it'll end up that way. And we can use kind of like greater than to know that the next number is going to definitely be higher than whatever our last number was. Or less than to make sure that we are capturing all of the records that came before the current record for whatever reason, whatever our business rules require of us. Okay, that's wonderful, but just as a bit of a side, kind of an important side, this is the default here. Okay, so identity, actually in the background, it has these 2 parameters automatically set for it. So where with all of our data types, we sometimes pass a parameter that tells us something about that data type. In the case of identity, we pass two parameters, and the first parameter says that I'm going to start at the number 1. My very first number that I ever create in this database is going to be number 1. And then every time I add a new surrogate number, these new ID numbers, I'm going to increase it by 1. So if I were to change this to 2000, that would mean the first number that it creates is 2000, and then the next number will be 2001, 2002, 2003, unless I want to count by hundreds. Then it would be 2000, 2100, 2200, 2300. And in some cases that makes sense to do. For example, if you want all of your ID numbers to be, say, 8 or 9 numbers long, like a student number 7 numbers long, they could have started at 1 with 6 zeros after it, and then always increased it by 1, and they know that their student numbers are always going to be 8 digits long until, of course, we go through more than 10 million students. And that is the identity specification in a nutshell, but let's actually run this with the different starting number, and I'll increase it by 25 just for fun. And I'm going to hit execute. Remember, we have our drop table here, so it'll drop our employee table and then recreate it. Oh, right, I had the drop table highlighted, so that's all that it ran. I want to run the create table. So when you do this, you just want to run the whole script. Be careful not to highlight something, otherwise you'll end up with that problem. Right click, edit top 200 rows. Okay. So we have, I'm going to put my name again, Marks. Then we have Marsha and Bob the Builder, Dora the Explorer, and of course we have Barney the Dino. Okay, now you can see it started, like we said, at 1 million. And then we got to 1,025,025 because we told it to increase by 25 every time. And you can see 1,050,000, 1,075,000, 1,100,000. So that's just how our identity specification works. Like I said, though, the default is 1,1, which means that if you omit the 1,1, it automatically does that for us. And that's the identity specification.